It's an honor and a pleasure, and I've known SB2 since I was in graduate school at Stanford and was Laura Arriaga's TA for her strategic philanthropy class. So I've read this SB2 case and certainly stayed in touch throughout the years. So I'm really delighted to be here today. I can give you just a brief background about how I came to Tipping Point, and then I'll launch into just an overview, but I really want to spend most of my time addressing your questions because they were really excellent and well-informed, and thank you so much for doing your homework in advance. Certainly makes my job more interesting when people are bringing so much knowledge to the table, and certainly from the work that you do as partners and as interested people in SB2's work and in engaged philanthropy models. So. And I would really like to make this interactive. I know there's sort of usually a presentation and then a Q&A, but I would, invite you to interrupt me and sort of if there's a comment that you'd like to hear more of, I certainly would want you to jump in and not wait till the official Q&A session. So briefly, my background: I've been at Tipping Point for 2.5 years. My role there is manager of strategic partnerships, and I'll get into what our partnerships mean and my work there. Before Tipping Point, I worked for the New York City Department of Education in the Office of New Schools, so helping the mayor and the chancellor open nearly 300 small schools and charter schools as part of the reform efforts there. And before that was at the Bridgestone Group doing strategic planning for nonprofits in the Bay Area. So had an interesting and varied path to where I am, but I think this theme of partnerships has been one of the constant themes in my work, and certainly a big emphasis at Tipping Point. So in terms of sort of the brief overview of Tipping Point, we were founded in 2005, so just over 5 years old, to really bring the same philosophy and mentality that the Robin Hood Foundation was able to bring to fighting poverty in New York City to the Bay Area. And I know someone had mentioned that you attended the David Salzman talk. Can I see a show of hands who else might have been there? Okay, so certainly a number of you. So essentially our mission is to find and fund the most effective organizations fighting poverty in the Bay Area. So folks who are on the front lines, educating, employing, housing, and supporting underprivileged adults and children and families in the Bay Area. And to date, we've raised $25 million. We are similar to Robin Hood in that we don't have an endowment, so we are called a foundation, but we walk in the shoes of the organizations we fund in that every year we start from zero, and we raise the money that we're able then the next year to invest in organizations in the community. We fund 27 organizations right now across 6 of the 9 Bay Area counties. And we do this with a staff of 14 people, and that's over the past 2.5 years about doubled since when I joined. So we've had a pretty rapid growth. I brought some copies of our annual report that shows exactly how the growth has happened throughout the years, but this past year was our largest fundraising year with $11 million raised. So that's our grant-making budget this year. So those of you who are familiar with Robin Hood's model this will sound familiar, but there are really 4 main guiding principles that we think make us unique, and that I'll address the similarities and differences with Robin Hood, but each of these 4 things is quite similar. So the first is that we are a 100% impact organization, and what that means is that our board of directors underwrites all of our operating costs, so that every dollar that a donor gives to us, we give 100% of that dollar to an organization that we fund. So it's a very leveraged model. That's something that really appeals to our stakeholders.
Could you explain that a little more? So the board of directors underwrites your operating costs.
Yes.
So that means they're donors. They are donors themselves, and it's not a percentage. You don't look at it as like I see, and I don't have a financial background. Okay, I should explain that to you too, in case I sound like an idiot. But I've seen those pies, and they'll show a piece of the pie that's like operating costs. But But your pie is changing every year. You're telling me the amount that you give away is totally fluid. And does the operating cost, like there's an expectation of the board members that they'll come up with a particular amount of money that pays you for 11 employees?
Yes.
So it's
So
pretty substantial.
it is, and our board has grown over time as our operating budget has grown over time, and that is one of the things that we are thinking about. I mean, Robin Hood has a board of over 50 people, and that has its they're a huge organization now. And they're able to still maintain that model, but it also raises some
Do they raise the money?
challenges.
Like it doesn't always come from their own personal wealth that these board members could go out and raise money, or generally?
I can't speak to Robin Hood in terms
to you.
of to us. Generally, it is sort of their personal,
Okay.
but we are actually. That's one of the things that we're kind of adapting over time. We haven't traditionally used our board members as ambassadors for additional fundraising beyond their financial commitment
Because
to the
you
organization.
want all your fundraising to go to programs.
Yes, and so so they are extremely generous. So we have a sort of a minimum amount that we ask every person on our board to contribute, and they've made the commitment to the organization that they actually believe so strongly in the work that we do that they don't mind funding operations. Many of them fund beyond the amount that we need for our operations, and so then that excess does go to our grant making. But essentially they want to be part of that value proposition to other donors to say, we believe so strongly in this work. We're actually funding operations so that other donors can be sure that their money is going directly to programmatic grant making.
Can you just give us a scope of what your operations are this year and your grant making budget fully?
Sure. So we're about almost $3 million operating budget and $11 million grant making. So the second element that we believe makes us fairly unique is our due diligence. So, as I'm sure you well know, there are 15,000 nonprofits in the Bay Area alone. And many donors, when they look at that landscape, it's very daunting in terms of how to determine, the best ones. And there are very interesting new models, Philanthropedia and GiveWell, and there are just some interesting ways out there for donors to be more informed. But we say, that's great for the people who want to do that. If you've seen Hope Consulting's Money for Good report, I don't know if that's something that you guys have discussed at all, but there are only 3% of donors out there who actually use that type of data to compare between investments. So most people are not going to do that homework, and so what we say is we'll do the homework for you. So we have an extensive due diligence process. Over the past 5 years, we've screened we've made visits and screened over 300 organizations to find these 27 groups that we believe are the most effective at fighting poverty in the Bay Area. And so that's something we're able to say, we know it's daunting, we're able to spend the time, pounding the pavement, making sure that we're scrutinizing, looking for strong leadership, clean financials, and measurable results so that you can be sure of the strength of your investment.
So there are organizations like Charity Navigator out there that use a pretty simplistic model. They just look at the percentage of overhead versus the percentage to program and don't consider other things. So I assume you guys are a lot more sophisticated in terms of your evaluation criteria.
Well, we hope so. We like to think we are, but so I mentioned a couple of the things that we look for. We have a very basic screen in terms of are they providing direct services to people in poverty in the Bay Area, and so as we've grown in terms of our name recognition, we've started to get a lot more kind of inbound inquiries. That's actually something that to address the question of what we've changed over time and what has and hasn't worked. We traditionally have said the kind of traditional funding application process is so convoluted that organizations are writing letters of interest and jumping through a lot of hoops, and we didn't want to recreate that dynamic. So we wanted to say, we'll go out, we'll find you based on word of mouth, referrals, and then we'll do the homework to, instead of asking folks to create a grant application, we'll ask for audited financials for the last 5 years. We'll ask for programmatic impact data. We'll ask for to meet the management team, kind of assess. In that way, we are similar to venture capital investors in terms of doing that really deep diligence.
Okay.
what's been interesting is that we've gotten a lot of questions about, well, that's great that you can come out and find us, but what if we actually want to apply? You might not hear of us, so how can we, get a little bit more information? So we've tried to be more responsive and be more transparent about what exactly are our criteria. Okay, if we don't come find you, what's a way for you to write a brief letter of interest? And so that's a way that we've found that, we'd still like to turn that dynamic on its head and not have a, 15-page grant application, but actually being more clear and transparent about our process is something that people have asked us to do. So that's the way we've tried to address that.
Okay, thanks.
So the third element that I'd like to talk about is around maximizing donor investments. So we believe that the check that we write to organizations is the beginning of the relationship. And one of the ways that we leverage the dollars that we invest is through providing what we call management assistance. And so this means, and this is essentially kind of the core of my job, this is beyond the dollars. When an organization has an issue, there's a legal question, whether it's a real estate challenge, whether it's a need for strategic planning, professional development, we want them to call us. And we pledge to them that if they let us know about a need, we will do whatever we can to go out and find the resources in the community for them to draw on. If we don't have the expertise in-house, we'll partner with a community organization or a corporate entity or an individual who might have those skills to connect those to the nonprofit that needs it. So an example that if you've read our case studies, you might have seen on our website, we have a partnership with McKinsey & Company, the strategy consulting firm. The organizations that we work with would never be able to afford McKinsey's fees. I mean, we wouldn't be able to afford McKinsey's fees that they charge typical corporate clients, but through our partnership, they're actually providing pro bono services to our grantees, and so they're able to get, the benefit of their expertise for their strategic plan. And so we have a list of partners, on our website, or I'm happy to share them with anyone who's interested in more details. But essentially, it's a way for us to kind of go beyond the dollars. And last year, we provided about $2.4 million of donated services, pro bono services, to our grantees. That was on top of a $6 million grant-making budget, so it's essentially 40 cents on the dollar that every donor gave us. We were able to leverage with additional services from the external world. So that's something that we're particularly proud of. That's definitely an area that I think we are growing and are learning about. One of the challenges that we've had, in terms of kind of what surprised us or what are we working on, is those partnerships tend to be pretty relationship-based and actually rooted in individuals within those companies. Mm-hmm. So, for example, very early on, we had a partnership with Accenture, and they were able to create websites for a number of our grantees. They implemented a Salesforce database at one of our organizations. Pretty phenomenal pro bono expertise. And then the partner that we were working with, who was actually on our board, left Accenture. Mm-hmm. And we, tried to maintain a relationship and, looked for additional touch points and, weren't able to maintain that when that individual left. So that's something that we are really thinking about. How do we embed those partnerships beyond, the individuals in the room? Certainly, we believe that we now kind of are a little bit more informed and are able to have more robust relationships within the corporations we work with. But I think it still remains a challenge and something that we're thinking about the best way to address. The fourth element that I think actually we believe makes us fairly unique, but somewhat similar to informed grant makers, is that all of our financial support, predominantly all, is in the form of general operating dollars. So if you've read the Bridgespan Group report, you might be familiar with the fact that only 21% of funders actually provide flexible dollars for nonprofits. A lot of funders prefer to restrict their dollars to programmatic support or direct them in some way. And we believe that infrastructure investments, things like databases, I mentioned before, strategic plans, investments in human capital, are so critical to having effective organizations that we want our dollars to go there. those things are so often viewed as luxuries in the nonprofit world, and for those of you that have spent time in the corporate world, they're not. They're necessities, and so that's a dynamic that we're really trying to turn on its head. Now, one thing that we have learned, again, going to learnings and things that we've changed, is that we've started to create an area that we call targeted investments. And so these are actually more directed dollars. This was both in response to our growth. So, if you can see in the annual report, our grant making budget has kind of gone up over the past 5 years, but we don't have complete visibility into how much money we'll be able to raise in a subsequent year. And so, for example, in 2009 and 2010, our grant making was $6 million both of those years. Now, flat was the new growth in that time, so say that we grew, but we weren't able to kind of raise across the board our organization's general operating support the way we've been doing over time. And so one of the ways that we've been, on the one hand, managing growth, and on the other hand, helping organizations make investments in areas that they find more challenging to invest in is through something called targeted investments. So these are areas, human capital being one of them, evaluation and technology being another one, where organizations find really hard to prioritize dollars. Even if we give them flexible dollars through general operating support, a lot of them, will put that money towards programmatic support, will kind of do everything that they need to do to make sure that they're delivering great services to their clients. And sometimes their employees aren't able to get the professional development they might need, or they might not be able to invest in the databases they might need to be able to improve their programs. And so this is a way that we're able to earmark dollars for those critical infrastructure investments so that our grantees are able to make them, whereas otherwise they might have trouble justifying it to their board or really allocating those dollars. So that's been an interesting area. I think we have a lot more to learn because we have pretty specific goals for each of those targeted investments, and on a relative basis, those are up to $25,000 per year for each of those areas. Our average general operating grant size this past year was $150,000. But from a sort of staff energy perspective, those targeted investments sometimes take as much or more effort than the actual general operating support. So if you were sort of to do the cost effectiveness for us in terms of those two investments, it would be, you'd sort of raise your eyebrows to why are you spending so much time on a $25,000 investment. So that's something that we're continuing to work out and put a much more kind of structured and transparent process in place for the grantees so that they're able to know kind of what they can expect from a targeted investment versus a general operating support grant. So those are some of the things that we've done. In terms of our issue area funding, we believe that there's no silver bullet to fight poverty. So we actually spread our investments over 4 portfolio areas: education, which is about 33% of our grant making; employment, which is about 32%; family wellness, child and family wellness, about 13%; and housing and homelessness assistance, about 22%. So it's a fairly balanced portfolio. I think more heavily weighted towards education and employment, and that's somewhat organic and somewhat deliberate in the sense that I know people mentioned that they were interested in kind of how we measure our impact and how we measure our grantees' impact. And we have someone whose his full-time job is essentially to think about our metrics. And we've kind of drawn on Robin Hood's work in this area and tried to push it a little further, at least make it a little bit more relevant to our work in the Bay Area. So we think about our metrics for organizations in a couple of different ways. First of all, we work with them for them to tell us kind of what are the most important programmatic metrics that you're tracking to make sure that your programs are doing a good job. So, and that's very specific based on the type of organization that it is. So, our charter school organizations are looking at their grade advancement, they're looking at graduation rates, they're looking at progress on API. They're looking at very specific education-based metrics, where our employment organizations are looking at job retention, they're looking at placement rates. So we are tracking programmatic metrics. One of the challenges with those is that if you think about how to allocate a dollar that our donor gives us, it's really apples to oranges. You know, the education organizations might be doing a great job, but you know, so are the housing organizations. And how do we really decide, you know, what's the most effective way to allocate that dollar? And so we have developed, based on Robin Hood's methodology, a benefit cost metric. And so that's thinking about, for those clients of the organization, thinking about what is the benefit to that client. So the way we think about that is in terms of the lifetime earnings, the change in that client's lifetime earnings based on participating in that intervention. So if it's a student going to a KIPP school, for example, and that's drawn from the research about, you know, how much money a high school and college diploma adds to your lifetime earnings. It's looking at kind of what would have happened to that student otherwise if they hadn't attended a KIPP school. And so thinking about kind of the net present value, if you will, of that that client's lifetime earnings divided by the cost of the intervention. And so again, it's trying to look at both the benefits that accrue in terms of lifetime earnings and the amount of money that it takes to run that program for that client. And so that's a way to kind of make comparisons across all of our 4 issue areas and understand how benefits and costs kind of compare to each other. You know, that really has its limits, so we certainly don't make any, you know, huge decisions based on that. It's kind of a piece of data that our board is interested in when we talk about potential investments. And so when I mentioned we're kind of weighted more heavily towards education and employment, it's because those tend to have the greatest connection and the greatest increase in clients' lifetime earnings. They're both.
Abby, you're modeling all that stuff, right? And you're not collecting individual specific data to feed into that model.
In terms
when
of,
you talk about lifetime earnings, you're making an assumption that
yes,
everybody goes through
we
the
are
program.
correct, exactly. There are a lot of assumptions behind that, and so that's why we don't, you know, use that as the sole criteria for
Right,
making our.
It's great that the board wants to see stuff at the systemic level.
Yeah, so we have a lot of assumptions behind that, as I said. And at the same time, we're working with our grantees so that they can get more accurate in that information as well. And so one of the questions was our partnership with Ed McConnell Clark Foundation and how that will affect our grant making over time. And I don't know, are you familiar with the Social Innovation Fund?
Can you share that? Because some people maybe probably aren't.
Sure. Yeah, so the Obama administration has allocated $50 million for the Social Innovation Fund, which is designed to fund organizations whose models have been proven effective and help take them to scale. And what's interesting is that, and they had a competitive application process for folks who would disperse that funding to these proven effective models. And Ed McConnell Clark Foundation in New York was, as Lance had mentioned, one of the largest recipients of that. We are partnered with them, which means that we are hoping to bring some of those federal dollars to effective programs in the Bay Area, whether that's scaling programs that have been effective elsewhere and bringing them to the Bay Area, or whether that's identifying those effective programs in the Bay Area and expanding them within. And so one of the challenges of the way the Social Innovation Fund defines proven effectiveness is that their criteria are extremely rigorous. So they're looking at the programs that have already had third-party evaluations involving, double-blind trials, and as if you're familiar with evaluation, those are extremely expensive, and so very few organizations, even nationally and internationally, have those. So one of the things that we're trying to do is identify what are the prerequisites before you even get to proven effectiveness that will indicate that you're on that path, that if you were to get those resources, your program would be proven effective. So right now, KIPP is probably the only of the 27 organizations in our program that has had those evaluations such that they are deemed proven effective. But we have a number of other grantees that we believe if they had the resources to do those evaluations, they would likely be proven effective. We just can't say without a doubt that they have. And so what are the other elements that are pretty key in moving towards that path of proven effectiveness? So that's one of the challenges with these funds, and
Can you
frankly,
tell us some of those key elements?
so I would want to refer you to my colleague who thinks
Okay.
much more deeply about this
Okay.
before I go too far down the path. But
But you can also get them on the websites.
Yeah.
social innovation fund, and
Oh,
Mahalo
that, well, I
Clark,
can get
yeah,
theirs, but
criteria.
but
Well,
these ones that they're anticipating when they're on the
Mhm.
path,
Like markers along the pathway, it sounds
do
like.
they have those?
but they outline what they are. I mean, within the SIF guidelines.
Right. Okay. But that'll be the final. I know they're very rigorous.
Yeah, and SIF is likely. I mean, they're probably aren't. I mean, my educated guess is that it will be challenging for
It was the same thing with I3,
exactly.
and I'm familiar with those. But what's really interesting to me is this idea that you presented, that if we could have markers to say they're on the path to be there someday, which makes it a good investment, before they would get the money to actually do that rigorous evaluation.
And
And
some
I
of
should look on their website.
It's pretty, I mean, but it's relatively simple. I mean, they'll say, I mean, what internal studies have you done?
Right.
Okay, and then what third-party studies have you done that aren't blinded?
So it's that kind of
right,
thing.
right, and randomized.
and
But
pre and
maybe
post
more
tests
specific.
and frankly looking at the strengths of their own data collection systems and understanding how are they, do they have unduplicated client counts, do they have some of these things that not all organizations are able to have because they don't have the internal systems and able to know across programs, are they serving one client with 5 different programs or 5 different clients.
You could be a huge help helping these organizations develop their internal data systems so that they will be on the right.
And that's one of the things that we are really working towards. So, both from a partnership perspective, we partner with Hewlett Packard down here, and they have been, we've allocated about $800,000 of technology hardware for our organizations to be able to use to build their evaluation systems with, because if you have a 10-year-old non-functioning computer, hard to run a cloud computing evaluation system. So that's definitely one of the areas that we are working on with our grantees. In terms, one of the things I'd heard that people were interested in terms of collaborations, both with other funders and others out there, that I'd kind of like to put out to this group as a question is really around our management assistance piece. So part of my job is to kind of understand the needs on the grantee side so that we know what are the most pressing issues that our organizations are not able to address internally or with the dollars that we and other funders are giving them. And then to take that list of needs and build our set of partnerships around them. So that might be partnering with another foundation that's providing funding and engaged grant making. So an example of a partnership we have there is with Reda. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them, but they are a Bay Area funder and actually a SIF grantee, SIF recipient, and ultimately a grantee that is working to create jobs through social enterprises. And so we have several shared grantees, and they are really engaged in working with the grantees that they have around, is that enterprise functioning well? Is it even making money? Because as we know, a lot of social enterprises end up being loss leaders for organizations rather than funding as they're intended to. And then, how can we grow that and expand that, the enterprise, so that we can grow the number of jobs created? And so that's something we've worked closely on REDF with. We have an MOU with them for a model that they're hoping to bring out from New York called CEO, Center for Employment Opportunities. That is actually a Robin Hood grantee in New York, and is a really interesting model partnered with state agencies for job creation for folks exiting the justice system. And so one of the challenges that we have, we know the dollar amount of value that our management assistance provides to our grantees. As I said, it was a little over $2.4 million. But we believe that that's really undervaluing the amount of assistance that we're providing. So what I mean by that is, we have a couple of ways that people who are interested in getting involved in Tipping Point are able to connect to opportunities. So one way is through a volunteer portal on our website. So we have 2 events a year where folks can really learn about our programs. We have a breakfast that's actually coming up next week. And our bigger event is in the spring. It's a big benefit where we raise actually a fair amount, I'd say probably 40% of our funding through a live auction. If you are familiar with Robin Hood, it's that same style, but a little more Bay Area and a little less New York hedge fund world. So but same kind of energy and great packages and interesting causes, and it's a really fun party. And so every year around those two events, we get huge numbers of inquiries, of folks who are interested. Just learned about the great organizations we fund, and they really wanted to get involved. And we would end up trying to call all of our organizations and say, what kind of volunteer opportunities do you have right now? Folks are interested in getting involved, and it just wasn't a great use of our time or the grantees' time. And so one of the things that we did was partner with volunteermatch.org. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them, but they're an online organization that connects people to volunteer opportunities in their community. And so we said, we have done the homework for folks to find the great organizations to connect to. Why don't we put a portal on our website where people can go in, enter their keyword, interest area, or zip code, and they'll then find among our 27 organizations the volunteer opportunities that align most closely with their interests or the geographic preferences. So that was a really leveraged way for us to kind of take ourselves out of the picture in terms of having to make the phone calls. Our organizations love it because they're getting, very interested volunteers. So a number of you mentioned reading partners. They are, phenomenally great at attracting volunteers. And so, for them to be able to have an area on our website where people who don't know reading partners but know Tipping Point can come in, say they're interested in literacy, find that volunteer opportunity, that's been really helpful for them. And really helpful for us because we've kind of taken ourselves out of the need to kind of be the middleman for those, lower touch volunteering opportunities. On the kind of high touch end, we have a board placement program. So we have, there are folks who are, further in their professional careers or just more interested in getting involved at a strategic level who want to connect to a board of directors opportunity. And we've developed a very, I think, we had initially a more organic process where we'd meet people, we'd, kind of get to know them, and then we'd refer them to organizations. And more recently, we've partnered with Credit Suisse, who has a partnership with Robinhood in New York and was looking to expand their program to San Francisco and Chicago. So we actually developed a formal board placement program where we have an online survey that asks folks, their skills and interest areas, and some other, areas around geographic preferences and life cycle stage of the organization. And then on our grantee side, gathering information about what types of board members they need in terms of the skills and in terms of the gaps that they have on their boards. And we're able to, in the last 6 months, broker 4 board connections. We've done about 10 over our lifetime. So if you think about over the past 6 months, we've done about half of those through this formal board placement program. And we believe this is a huge area of growth because there are lots of folks who are looking to get involved. And if you've ever, I know SB2 is an incredible way to be involved, but if you haven't found that type of organization, it seems very daunting and you're not sure where to look. So we've had about, as I said, 10 of these board placements. And right now we're not capturing any value through those board placements. We sort of, say, okay, we made those connections, but how do we make sure that we're in some way reflecting that service that we've provided to the organization? On the volunteer end, I know that there are, kind of various metrics for what's the value of a volunteer hour. We're not asking the folks that we connect to track their hours, although Volunteer Match provides that functionality, but realistically, I doubt that people would really do that. On the board end, again, we don't ask questions about, we know when those connections are made, but we don't ask how much time they're spending on the board, but those of you on boards know what a significant time commitment that is. So that was a question I wanted to put out in terms of if you had any creative ideas of how we might think about measuring the impact of some of these kind of non-financial contributions that we're able to connect to our grantees. We've done our own third-party evaluation. We get grantee feedback after workshops and other things that we provide. And again, we track the dollar value of our donated services and products. But there are some other pieces that we know we're missing, these intangibles. So I'm curious if people have seen other organizations doing a good job of evaluating those kind of non-financial elements, or just other models that might be interesting for us to look at.
Well, Social Venture Partners International uses, they actually have a model for calculus of the hours of volunteer time times the monetary value. And it was validated by a study done at USC as far as not necessarily that it was a valid number, but that the process they used to do the calculations and to collect the data was valid. So I'm just thinking maybe we could have SVPI send you a piece on how they're doing the calculations. They do it across the whole network, 27 and 16 affiliates.
And we are one of those affiliates.
And it's actually probably a more valid number because it's not for the average frontline volunteer, it's for people who are doing capacity building. So that could be anywhere from the board to, you know, management consultant or somebody who owns a marketing communications firm. And that number varies between like $100 and $200 an hour as monetizing it.
You would be even more disciplined if you had your hands around. You could get more precise input on the hours spent. Because we're collecting data through personal surveys around the country. But it turned out to be very useful in talking about that human contribution or the intangible piece.
Well, and then how to expand it. I mean, just a full disclosure. So Nancy was Michael Lombardo's executive coach when you guys paid for his professional development at Reading Partners.
Yeah,
Got it.
no
problem.
I'm downstream on that.
But I mean, just kind of thinking about this, I mean, you talked about the whole human capital component, right? And then, so obviously professional development for an executive director is key because a board that's not that sophisticated may not want to invest in that, just like they wouldn't want to invest in the technology. But you didn't talk about it, and maybe you're thinking already doing it in terms of kind of professional development for the board as kind of one of your targeted investment strategies, because then that allows you a hook to go in as part of an annual governance process and check-in and to do surveys and capture all that data.
No, that's a great point, and that is something that we, again, are kind of thinking about how to do. One of the things we've done this year that was actually a pilot program that worked out phenomenally well was so historically we had kind of 4 times a year where we held what we called development roundtables. So these were opportunities for folks in the development functions within our grantees to come together and learn about an issue area relevant to development. So we had one on holding a successful event. We had one on storytelling, and several of you were at the Fly breakfast yesterday and sort of talked about the power of the stories that were told there. We've had ones on social media and how making effective use of social media. And it was a different set of folks who came every time. As you know, there's a lot of turnover in the development world. So sometimes there were familiar faces, sometimes there weren't. And each time per quarter, as people came together, those sessions weren't really connected to one another. So it was kind of a individual point in time experience. And one of the things that we heard from our organizations is that it would be great to have a more comprehensive, cohesive program around fundraising and communications, because that's a huge need. There, is never enough money to invest in that, and it's so critical to the organization. So we launched something that we called FACT, which was creatively acronymed for fundraising and consulting or communications training. And it was an 8-month program where we brought in 2 experts, one from the fundraising world and one from the communications world, both firms, and they provided 8 half-day sessions to a cohort of 14 of our organizations. The executive director was required to attend 6 of those 8 sessions, and for different relevant sessions, they could bring in the other person in their organization, whether that was their board chair, whether that was their development director, their communications person, or someone wearing all of those hats to the relevant session for a working session. And each organization also got 8 hours of customized consulting in both fundraising and communications from the providers as part of that experience. And so, we just got overwhelmingly positive comments. And I think what was so interesting to me is that we often, as funders, kind of think of ourselves as needing to find the experts, to connect to our organizations. And what was so powerful, sort of watching these executive directors and other folks go through the experiences, how much they ended up being resources for one another. And that peer learning and the opportunity to, get feedback on their elevator pitches from, a fellow grantee saying, I'm not in the education world, but I didn't understand a word that you were saying. You started talking about, this jargon, and it doesn't make sense to me, or, stop with the acronyms. And, it was a very there was a lot of trust in the room that people were able to be so candid, but I think it made such a difference in, people's, and it was a lot of role playing, which I think initially everyone was like, no, I don't like the role playing, but it's so powerful, right? Because that's what you really need in order to improve and to really see how you sound when you're being filmed or being, critiqued by your peers. And so I think that cohort model of, the workshops and the associated consulting time is one that we're going to be using and adapting in the future and thinking about other topics. And when we surveyed the participants, the kind of top area of need that came out was around this human capital and professional development, talent cultivation piece. So that's probably when we look towards 2011, what we're going to be working on and thinking about who the right set of folks in terms of providing that. And then to Lance's point, how do we get the board involved? Because that's such a huge area where we think there's so much potential for connections and strengthening within our groups and their leadership.
You were asking about how to capture the value of non-financial contributions, and I mean that's it's a qualitative issue also. So I'm thinking about how we might capture it, and I was talking to a program director just yesterday, and he mentioned the value that Jason had given him. By interviewing a program director and having him tell you, these are the things that happened as a consequence of this person working with me. Mm-hmm. For instance, I was about to go off on this tangent, and this person pulled me back so that I would focus my time on this issue. That's a qualitative thing that you can't really just count up. But if you could track sort of the behaviors or the actions that happened as a result of this consultant working. Mm-hmm. Or and sometimes there is other money, because this person was working with you. I had the groundwork already done, in strategic planning, so that when I did this other proposal, I had this work done. So I would think that some in-depth interviews, with people about the benefits of working with somebody would be helpful.
Yeah, but sometimes the ED will say, because of this consultant, I saved X amount of dollars, or I got extra amount of dollars just because of this consultant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what's interesting about the fundraising piece is that does tie so directly. I mean, in terms of improving your elevator pitch or being able to kind of have a compelling kind of master narrative that you're able to share about your organization. That does lead directly to dollars. I think we haven't done those in-depth interviews. We had a survey after the training, but I think the next step would be to kind of dig deeper and with a little bit of time. And we had just ended this in September, and sometimes we can't really measure the result of that kind of training until 6 months from that point. So we do plan to bring the group back together in March and kind of understand how well they've been able to implement some of those things that they learned, what's been the challenges.
Yeah, the other thing is you can have them write stories. That's another thing, like a mentor. I'm thinking I work for a new teacher center. And one of the things we've been doing is having mentors. We have a lot of stuff that's hard to capture with mentors, assistance and support. And you can even get the people, just to write, like the interview I was doing with this person. He was just telling me the story. And either I can ask the questions, or they, if they had extra time to write, they would have a lot to share.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and SV2 actually did a survey like that of a few of our current grantees last year, and it was mostly data, but at the end we asked for a story, and they were really rich.
Well,
just over SurveyMonkey.
Testimonials, right? That's in the business world. That's what you go for. Customer references.
So, I mean, the FACT program was, I'm asking because we've been involved with a version of that, although not as well organized certainly as what you described. But how did you select, or how did people get into that program? Was it something where people could volunteer? Did you select them from some cohort? What was the criteria?
It's a good question, and that is definitely something that we are evolving kind of our thinking on. We strive very much to never require participation to anything. So we go out of our way to say, this is voluntary, this is opt-in. There are a lot of funders that say, oh, it's optional, but really you better be there if you want to get funding. We're trying to break that dynamic. However, we felt that the strength of the program would really be in a consistent cohort. And so we wanted people to be able to opt into the training, but once they opted in, we sort of required attendance for the entire session. So what we did was send out an description to all of our organizations that were in good standing. And so I should say, since I haven't touched on this yet, that we've recently developed, I'll just go on this brief tangent and then come back to your question, we've recently developed this status of under review for those grantees that aren't meeting our collective goals that we've set for each year. So we have grant agreements with our grantees where we collectively develop a set of goals for the year, and then at 6 months and a year into those 1 year agreements, we monitor and kind of assess progress towards those goals, as well as look at financial sustainability and all of those things. And when there arises a situation where progress against goals has not been on track, or there's been a change in leadership or something else that would kind of lead us to believe that this isn't actually going well, then we have developed a status that we are calling under review, where we communicate to our organizations that we're a little more concerned. We're going to meet more frequently, so once a quarter rather than twice a year, and kind of work together on strengthening things so that we can get them on track. Now, I would say that in the vast majority of cases, things get back on track, and there haven't been that many organizations that have gotten under review, but in a couple of instances, probably 4 over the lifetime of Tipping Point, we have parted ways with an organization because it has become clear to both of us that the engaged relationship was not working. Either they didn't want a funder poking around so closely, or we decided that that financial strength based on audits or a change in leadership where someone wasn't really interested in kind of being more than just a grantee in name only, warranted not continuing in our portfolio. So we have kind of defunded, if you will, organizations where things haven't worked out. But and so in terms of kind of offering opportunities, we'll offer them to the set of grantees that are in good standing, so not under review, and we'll lay out kind of what you would get out of the program and what we would expect from you. So I mentioned the 6 executive director attending 6 of the 8 sessions, which is actually, for an executive director, a huge amount of time. But we really wanted to make sure that folks knew that the commitment was to the organizational leadership, and not certainly invite other people to participate as necessary, but as the ED is the spokesperson for the organization and that organization's champion, it was so critical that they be part of this training. And so we required them to provide a very small, relatively speaking, financial commitment. So the cost of the training for each organization was $1,000 over this 8 months. If they attended every single session, so either the executive director attending 6 sessions and then other people attending those 2 other sessions, they got a 50% refund, so it cost $500. So we had some incentive for full participation. The cost to us was about $12,000 per organization. So it was a real kind of more to have a skin in the game for the grantee as opposed to a real kind of paying their way, for example.
That was separate from their grant amount.
Correct. Correct.
And these were 8 sessions just around the fact, the fundraising.
Yeah. So the idea was that each session addressed part of what would at the end be a comprehensive fundraising and communications plan for the organization. So.
Yeah. So once an organization enters your portfolio, do you intend to keep them there indefinitely unless there's a reason to part ways, or is it a fixed period of years?
That's a great question. We are a long-term funder, so we say that once you become part of our portfolio, as long as there's progress towards goals and continued desire on both sides for an engaged relationship, you're there for forever. And so we have grantees that have been in our portfolio for 5 years. I think one of the questions that our board is asking us, and that I think Robin Hood has faced, is there ever an exit strategy, or is the goal to help grantees become sustainable so that they don't need to be in the portfolio? And
that's one way. Our models differ with SV2. It's specifically a 3-year commitment, and we look for sustainability after 3 years.
So, and I'm interested. I mean, how often are organizations sustainable after 3 years? Because I imagine that I could see them, that being a real goal, but it being extremely challenging to. That's a great question.
So how would you keep adding new organizations? Because your budget would just have to yeah, keep growing to add new organizations.
Yeah, so we've added about, we've slowed our growth. So we've, there were years, kind of the second and third year, where we added, almost 10 organizations a year. The past couple years, we've been bringing on about 3 or 4 organizations per year, and that's because of a deliberate decision to go deeper with our current organizations rather than kind of the original business plan for Tipping Point was, to get to 50 organizations in our portfolio in the first, after 5 years. And, the board really pushed us on, is it about just adding more organizations, or is it really about kind of deepening the impact within the set of organizations that we work with? And so we did make a deliberate decision to slow our growth in terms of kind of the implications of SIF and some of the, funding that we are kind of committing ourselves to raising down the road. There are, implications for kind of increased growth, but I think we've just completed a 3-year plan, thinking about kind of our impact and kind of fundraising goals over the next 3 years. And so it's what we've kind of targeted is $60 million over the next 3 years in terms of our fundraising goal. And that's both in terms of kind of adding a number of grantees, deepening our commitment to existing grantees in terms of helping them move on the spectrum towards effectiveness, so working on databases, working on other things for those organizations, and thinking about innovation. And so one of the things that we're really committed to, I heard someone ask about innovation earlier, is finding innovative and promising models and bringing them to the Bay Area. So an example of this is an organization called Single Stop. I don't know if anyone has heard of it, but it was started in New York as a program of Robin Hood, actually, designed to help low-income individuals and families capture the benefits, the federal benefits and tax credits that they're entitled to, but don't actually draw down because of the complicated way that you need to kind of go to individual agencies. So it was kind of designed to be a one-stop shop for low-income folks to come in. They do an assessment through a benefits calculator and are able to connect them to, thousands and thousands of dollars of public funding that they're already entitled to. And so we actually helped bring the Single Stop model to the Bay Area. It's now operating in 6 locations throughout the Bay Area, and it's going to be expanding through, I think down here, the closest organization that has a Single Stop site is a Job Train. And they work in a couple of city colleges in San Francisco. So it's really kind of taking an existing service center, raising awareness about the fact that you can go to that site, sit down with a benefits counselor. They actually have volunteers from Charles Schwab Company who come in and volunteer their time to be to be financial counselors for folks to, once they have a sense of what benefits they're entitled to, how are they going to work on asset building and savings and other things like that. And so it's an innovative program that we helped kind of bring out here. So I think part of our strategic plan is really about what are those other models that are doing great things in other parts of the country that we can bring to the Bay Area and make sure we can benefit from those as well.
I've never heard that before, but it's so significant. Even the earned income credit has to be a challenge for a lot of people to file for.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I mean, it's an astonishing amount of money that goes untapped every year.
I have a comment and a question. A comment relates to SB2, that even though our funding stops after 3 years, we sometimes have developed relationships during that time that last beyond the 3 years.
And we still bring members that, anybody who's gotten funding can still come in and take advantage of the classes. And they're still invited to our events. They're still welcome to call and say, I need help in this area. We're about to do a strategic plan. Do you have anybody who can help us out? Those kinds of things. And Mark, Mark has been, he's a lawyer here, and he's been involved with several organizations well after the grant stuff.
And then I have a question. So I was wondering, and maybe you could help answer this, is the model that she's talking about similar to New School's venture fund, which you're probably familiar with? They do it in education, but as I understand it, they have once you're in, and you get to go to their conference that they have once a year, that you're in their portfolio and you get to stay, right? Is that similar?
Every
or is
organization is
that-
different, but yeah, you're part of
Is
the
it a
family.
similar
But I mean,
model?
your model is that you're funding them. Right
Uh-huh.
now, the current model is you fund them forever as long
Forever,
as they
And
don't
New
go
Schools
on.
Venture Fund doesn't do that? Do they end the funding at some point? You're just in for,
Well, they're in a
do they
specific
fund
fund
for-
round,
right.
so that they only have dollars. So it's a
So they
blind
raise
pool,
money
and they
for-
raise the money up front, and then they spend the
so
money.
you're only in the network, but
It's
you're
not
in
an annual. This is an
financial.
annual fund.
I
You guys are
understand.
raising the money on an
It's
annual basis.
And another key difference with New Schools Venture Fund is that we don't take board seats. So we believe that that's an area that we're really engaged, but we don't need to be
Right.
that engaged. And we believe that if we were to have a board seat, there would actually be some things that we would probably miss, or we would sort of assume that we already knew because we were on the board. And so that's been a question that we can come back to and think about. Does this mean forever we won't take a board seat, or will we take a board seat on some maybe some of these innovation investments where it's a little bit more complicated, and we do tend to be more engaged in when we were helping start Single Stop out here, and for the most recent sort of bigger scale initiative, integrated health center in San Francisco, we're much more involved in that on almost a day-to-day basis. So there might be some times where it is more appropriate for us to take a formal board seat, but we haven't to date.
Interesting.
You had mentioned programmatic metrics for the organizations that you fund. So are most of them able to provide those to you?
All of our organizations provide some set of metrics that we work with, and relevant to the type of program that they are. I think there is a spectrum of sort of the data savviness of our organizations, and that there are some that it's no problem. They sort of churn this out, and they're looking at the data to really drive their own programmatic improvement, and reporting to us is no problem. And there are other organizations that it is. When we started working with them, they were literally tabulating, on paper to track the number of students they were able to help to get GEDs. And for those types of organizations, we work with them really closely on developing their systems so that it is less labor intensive, and that they're able to have a data-driven culture, not only to report to us, but really to make programmatic improvements internally. And that's that's something that is is sort of symptomatic of the field in general, that there is this starvation cycle where they don't have the money to invest in these infrastructure improvements, and thus aren't able to get the data they need to report to funders and attract new funding. So but we're definitely working with all of our grantees across the spectrum to constantly make sure are all the things that we're asking you to collect relevant. We actually are having we recently assembled an advisory board to inform our metrics work. And so, folks who are in the evaluation fields, working at organizations like MDRC and other places where they're really thinking deeply about this, to make sure that we're able to tap into external expertise around the latest results, to think about what makes for an effective program in the juvenile justice field, or in the homelessness prevention field. And so that's definitely something that we're very early on in our thinking. It's been informed by Robin Hood's past 20 years, but we know there's a great deal further to go on that.
So everybody, we have about 10 minutes left with Abby before we need to wrap up. So if anybody has any last burning questions.
So how can SB2 best work with you then?
Well, I would love to put that question back to SB2. I mean, I know that we have some organizations that we funded, like Fly and others, and I'm curious in terms of kind of the way I described us working, where do those natural points appear in terms of plugging in, whether it's over shared grantees, whether it's around some of the capacity building work that it sounds like we're both doing. I think we're extremely interested in finding those points of connection, and that is something that a lot of our donors really push us on. How are you working with other funders, and particularly engaged funders, because we want to be leveraging each other's work, not duplicating it. And so I'm curious if anything occurred to anyone in this room about, oh, we're doing something very similar, or, oh, that's something we've thought about, or.
Well, one thing I just quickly mentioned to Lance as you were talking about your FACT program is, and that sounds very relevant to me. It's one of the things that I work with grantees on individually, here as well. So at some stage, perhaps some of us could come to see you and learn more about that. But that seems to me to be a program in some form that would be very valuable to our and would be something that would, I think, move the ball forward.
Mhm.
So,
And I would just say that that is an area of huge,
yeah.
maybe our top area of growth in the next year at SV2 is being better at engaging with our grantees beyond the dollars. Because, you know, we have people who put in massive amounts of time and then kind of burn out, and then, you know, and it's making it so that lots of different partners can be involved. It's having these partnerships with other, and we're actually having a staff person start next year through the Encore program that's going to be working specifically on this. So that will be awesome for that, and for partners who are interested in them to work with Abby on this.
Well, training in general,
Mm-hmm.
and key areas like fundraising,
Mm-hmm.
communications, marketing's another one.
Mm-hmm. Because we have had workshops, but they've been very one-off, and I mean, taking it to the next level is something we could learn so much
I mean,
from.
you have a curriculum, right, over most of the year, and so that's a different model than what we have attempted to date, but it certainly is something where I can see would add a great deal of value.
Mm-hmm.
And especially because that means that more than one partner could deliver it. You know, at different times we could have different partners step in and deliver it when it comes out.
Did you see you hired firms, outside firms for this purpose?
Yeah,
and
we
you-
did.
For that, and they were paid, they were compensated for this?
Yeah.
So is it your own curriculum then, or is it you're outsourcing?
Um,
You're just delivering it?
It is. We did not develop the curriculum. We provided guidance to the folks who were, you know, assembling it. But I would say, and actually, you know, the two firms that we worked with were Building Blocks Consulting, so Nate Levine in his shop on the fundraising side, and Fenton Communications on the communications side. And they actually, I think, you know, the sort of response to this program has been so overwhelmingly positive that they're putting together a case study of the FACT work, and I think, you know, are likely to be trying to make it available to other folks. I mean, I think that is was an area that it was so interesting. I mean, talking about serving on boards, Nate Levine and Parker Blackman, who heads Fenton, serves on the board together of an organization, and had, you know, talked about maybe at some point doing some work together, because they're two, you know, sides of the same issue, fundraising and communications. And this was such a fortuitous coincidence that they happened to already know each other, were interested in working together, and so we were able to bring them together. But I believe, you know, they would have kind of proprietary rights to what they developed, but are interested in bringing it to more organizations.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things we could pursue, just talk about right away. I'll just put them out on the table, you can percolate on them, and then we can get back together. But I mean, just to go back to what everybody said, I think that there's probably a third component. I mean, so there's the fundraising, there's the communication, there's the leadership, right? And I'd specifically kind of focus on the board leadership, which is, I think, a component that we could bring to it. So you could kind of think about it as a combined offering of the three. And then another way to think about getting people on, I mean, the Credit Suisse partnership that you mentioned is really good. One of the things that we found is that if you lower the bar for people, so they're kind of not signing up for a board for like 6 years or 2-3-year terms, you know, it's the rest of their life, but actually provide it as a 1-year fellowship, so they're kind of go on as a non-voting member. But then, you know, we've been running that program for 2 years, and most of those people actually become board members. But it's a way to date before you get married. That can also be a part of, you know, a component of that program, or kind of a separate thing that runs in parallel.
So you do that for SV2
Yeah.
partners who
Yeah.
are interested in serving on
Exactly.
boards. But
Exactly. And they go on boards like Fly and Reading Partners. Actually, there's like 2 on each right now. It's
Yeah.
1-year fellows.
that's really interesting. Yeah, it's almost, you know, the a lot of business schools have the, you know.
Right. I mean, it's kind of
That's what
copied
it's
under the
based on.
standard GSB
Okay.
model. for
Got
that.
it.
Is that separate than being on an advisory board, or do these?
Yeah, because you're a full-time board member, you get the PAC, you participate in all the executive
I
discussions.
see.
Just because I'm on both of all those boards, right? I mean, so those people are listened to, right? Because they're substantive people. People pay attention. Even
Yeah.
though they're a non-voting member, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, that's actually really interesting. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how that works.
And then the other thing that we should talk more about is the, you know, the SVP network is really getting more collaboration focused. So we're just pulling out a new strategic plan. So the whole idea of working with somebody to basically mine 26 metro regions in the U.S. for things that would be great to come to San Francisco for fighting poverty is another thing that we should look at collaborating on.
That's great.
And we have done a couple of, we did our big education grant round. We actually partnered with 2 other local foundations.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a very and we ended up funding more organizations than we would have, making it a bigger, broader impact. Setting up as part of the grant, we actually have set up a regular peer-to-peer meeting. And this is for out of school.
It's a 3-year cohort.
It's a 3-year cohort where it's being funded by one of our partners.
Mm-hmm. That was with Packard and
With
Sandhill.
That's really neat.
And so that was really fun because we got to learn how Sandhill looks at things and how Packard looks at things. They got to learn how we did things. And I think we've got some more relationships there. And we kind of learned about a lot.
But also very labor intensive, like you've been
Yes.
talking about with partnerships. And I think that's a big area for SB2 to learn is how to, really make partnerships work.
Yeah, I mean they're essential and they're tough. Yeah. Well, I thank you so much.